Looking forward to this one. Just a couple of little jokes relating to the DFB. What word begins with the letter F and ends in UCK? Well, fire truck. Apparently, is not only further else. What does the word chaos mean in relation to the firefighting services in Dublin here, and indeed the emergency services? Well, apparently, I never knew this. Apparently, it means the chief has arrived on scene. You hear the fire brigade speak of chaos, they're only talking about the chief. Okay? And what did the firefighter say? Laz knows the answer to this one, he's attended many of them. What did the firefighter say when the church caught fire? Very simple one, holy smoke. So before we go any further, folks, if you just put your mobile phones on silent, there's a donation box at the bottom of the hall. As you know, there are no membership fees for the Tallaght Historical Society, and we depend on the donations of our members to keep everything running. In the event of a fire, follow Laz out the door, up the stairs, and away to our left-hand side as quick as your legs can carry you. Without further ado, Laz follow.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for coming along this evening, especially on such a wet evening. I really appreciate the turnout here. Guns and Hoses, Dublin Fire Brigade and the Irish Revolution. In the book, I looked at the brigade from the period from 1892 to 1923, and I picked 1892 because it was a pivotal year in the history of Dublin Fire Brigade. The brigade was actually 30 years old at that stage. It had been formed in 1862. But 1892 was a pivotal year. The brigade's second chief officer, Captain Boyle, was retiring, and two events happened that had long-term influences on the DFB over the next 30 years. That's Captain Boyle there in the old fire station, the old number 2 station down at Whitehorse Yard, which is now buried under civic offices like so much else. That would have been, the original headquarters would have been in Coppinger Road there, where some of you may remember it as the Civic Museum in South William Street. The basement of that was the original headquarters, and there was a fire unit stationed down in the Waterworks Yard in Whitehorse Yard. During Boyle's time as chief, the brigade, as I say, formed in 1862. The first chief officer, Captain Ingram, had built it up over the 20 years that he was in charge. During Captain Boyle's time, the brigade had stagnated somewhat. We'd also had the first deaths in service of firemen. John Kite was killed in a building collapse, and 2 other firemen were killed in 1891 in Westmoreland Street when equipment failed, the ladder broke. There was some controversy about the running of the brigade. Captain Boyle decided to retire. He was quite an old man at that stage. He'd come into the Dublin Fire Brigade from the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Although he wasn't an officer in the police, he was attached to the DNP. So he retired, and the corporation set up an inquiry into the brigade. And one of the things they did is they visited fire stations elsewhere in the United Kingdom. As a result of that, the firemen in Dublin did something which no other fireman anywhere had done up to that point. They formed a trade union. Dublin Fire Brigade was the world's first unionised trade union fire service. The reason for that, and for that acceptance of trade unionism within the job, came from the fact that many firemen at the time came from a background within the craft unions. The preferred men to be selected as firemen were either sailors or builders, men in the building trades, men like plumbers, stonemasons, carpenters, men who understood how a building was put together, and therefore also understood how a building would come apart. The other people, of course, being sailors. At the time, we're talking about the era of sailing ships, tall ships. So these were men who were used to working at heights. They were men who were used to working in dangerous conditions and using heavy equipment in as I say, hazardous conditions. The other thing with craft unions in Dublin at the period, in the 1890s, the craft unions would have been strongholds of the Fenian movement. There were quite a number of Fenians from the earlier period, from the 1860s, 1870s and 1880s, were now quite influential within the Dublin trade union movement. The trade union movement, of course, at this stage, you're talking about craft unions. if we think about trade unions in Dublin, we generally think about 1914 and the lockout and the transport and general workers. But on the kind of pyramid of trade unionism, the men at the top were the craft unions. And as I said, there was a very strong Fenian influence in that. The first secretary of the Dublin Fire Brigade Men's Union was P.T. Daly, who was then a member of the Supreme Council of the IRB and later was on the committee which formed the Citizen Army. He wasn't himself a member of the Fire Brigade, he was employed by the firemen to act through the Dublin Trade Council on their behalf. Interestingly enough, an earlier connection to the Fenians, in 1866, one of the first firemen, Thomas Baines, had been arrested for Fenian activities. He was involved in recruiting British soldiers, Irishmen in the British Army, into the Fenian movement. He was transported to Australia. He had been, prior to joining the Fire Brigade, he'd been a member of the Papal Brigade in Italy and had served there in the Papal Brigade with people like Miles Keogh, who would have been on to fight with Custard and died the Little Bighorn. Baines was arrested on the word of an informer, a man called Pierce Nagle, who had been very much involved in the Fenian movement in Dublin, but had been passing information to the castle. He was working with a man called Pagan O'Leary. I don't know if any of you, I've just come across this man in connection with this research, but he's a fascinating character. Pagan O'Leary was from Cork originally, went to America and was studying for the priesthood when the Mexican-American War broke out. He left the seminary and went to fight with the Mexican army. Now, I don't know if he was in the St. Patrick's and the San Patricios or if he just fought generally within the Mexican army, but returned to the United States afterwards and became very much involved in the Fenian movement and very, very, very anti-religious for, I suppose, a few years in the seminary we did that at the time. But he was sent to Ireland to recruit soldiers. It was felt that his background and the military background that he picked up in the Mexican-American War would give him common ground with the soldiers he'd be dealing with. And when he came to Dublin, he made contact with the fireman, Thomas Baines. As I say, both were given away in the end by Pierce Nagle, and Thomas Baines became the first Dublin fireman to visit Australia. That's the Fenian influence. The other big thing from the Brigade's point of view was the working conditions in 1892 were very, very poor. Men lived on the station, and in the like of White Horse Yard they lived in tenements beside it. There was no accommodation there. They were on constant duty, and one of the requests in a memorial sent by the new Dublin Fire Brigade Men's Union to their employer was a request for 7 days off per year. Now, this wasn't a week's holidays they were looking for. This wasn't to be 7 consecutive days. It was to be 7 out of the 365. Because at that time, the firemen, there was no guaranteed day off. What would happen was, on occasion, your turn would come to request time off, and you'd present yourself to the officer in uniform. A fireman in those days was in uniform from the day he joined to the day he left. He would need special permission to be in civilian clothes. He had to own a set of civilian clothes in case the corporation fired him, because he couldn't leave in the uniform, but he couldn't wear them in the normal run of events. You would present yourself to the officer, you would ask for the day off, which you might have been waiting 3 months for at this stage, and depending on the manning situation in the job, you might or might not get it. If somebody was sick in another station and had been injured at a fire the night before, you took their place. Now, it didn't mean that you got the next day off, it meant that in another 2 or 3 months it was your turn to ask again. So 7 days, just to give you a flavour of working conditions and a flavour of the kind of demands we're making. 7 days, as I say, out of the 365. The living conditions were described as absolutely appalling. Married men had rooms, were allocated rooms in tenements of 10 foot by 8 foot, regardless of the size of the family. And again, you see in records of the time where it literally meant that a man could put up night duty, couldn't go to bed because the room was only big enough to hold one large bed. And he would have to wait for other members of the family to get up so he could go to bed. The union, began to organise, it began to put claims in, it began slowly to chip away at this edifice, this Dublin Corporation, that's a word there, no. They slowly but surely conditions began to improve. And a strong, very strong trade union spirit developed within the job. There was a sense of camaraderie anyway from the type of job they were doing and from the conditions that they worked under and the fact that they were, you know, it was a dangerous job and it lent a certain camaraderie to it. But the trade union spirit became very, very developed within the job. The other big change in 1892 was a new chief officer. And the chief officer who came was Thomas Purcell. Purcell was from Kilkenny. He was an engineer by profession and a volunteer fireman in the Kilkenny Fire Brigade. He'd been decorated for courage for saving a woman's life from a fire in the city. He was a keen student of firefighting and he travelled extensively to see new developments in England, Germany and the United States. And he'd bring modern ideas and equipment into use in Dublin. He was also an innovator and an inventor. For instance, when Dublin's tram system was electrified, the old-style street escapes could no longer be used. At one stage in the city, at night, street fire escapes, wheeled escapes were dotted around the city with a fireman standing with it in a sentry box. When the tram system came in, it was an electrified tram, very much like our Lewis system now, so the upright ladders couldn't run anymore. And Purcell's answer to it was to design a turntable ladder, one of the first in Europe. The Germans were working on a similar design at the time. This was the first to come into use in the British Isles. The ladder itself was a very successful design. He patented it, and a number of the UK brigades would have gone on to use this as well. In 1909 he decided to enter the motor age and he designed a motor fire engine for Dublin, which was to be built by Leyland Motors. It was the first fire engine that Leyland built, and it was built to Purcell's specific design. Leyland would have gone on to use that model and develop it to become one of the biggest British fire engine manufacturers in the day. We bought that one in 1909, and in 1912 a second one was bought to equip Thomas Street Fire Station, which opened in January 1913. 1914, of course, the lockout. The brigade, as public servants, weren't involved in the lockout. It was, as I was saying earlier, Transport General Workers Union, but it was a very much unionised job. There's evidence of collections and money being gathered and passed on to Larkin and the Transport and General Workers Union. They were regarded with suspicion and dislike by the Dublin Metropolitan Police because they made their politics and their feelings in the matter very clear, I should say. And they were described by David Nelligan, a young David Nelligan who joined the DMP at that stage, as unfriendly to the police, on the radical side, and always sorely to the DMP. It mightn't be the worst thing that I've said about you in terms of the 1913 lockout. Now, 1914, the following year, brought war to Europe and the recruiting sergeants to Dublin. In spite of an agreement which held the job of any Dublin Corporation worker open and would continue on half pay if he joined the British forces, only 2 Dublin firemen did so. There was a very deliberate attempt to encourage firemen to join because firemen would be recruiting sergeants' dream. They're uniformed, disciplined men who are used to working under pressure and used to taking charge of situations. Dublin, because it also provided an ambulance service, they'd be very skilled in aid and so forth. It's odd that in Dublin only 2 out of over 50 men who would have been eligible joined. One of them, Patrick Bruton, I did some research on him a few years back for his family, and he joined the Irish Guards. He actually lied about his age to make himself younger. He was 38 in 1914, but he lied about his age to make himself 35 so he could go into frontline service. He ended up as a sergeant in the Irish Guards. He survived 2 very serious wounds and came back, and he won a military medal along the line. He came back to the brigade in 1919, having been discharged as 50% disabled due to head wounds. He served another 15 years in the Dublin Fire Brigade over. The other man who went was John Murphy, and John Murphy joined the Army Service Corps, where he was a corporal. He was able to trace him as far as 1915. He was a corporal in the Mediterranean at that stage and was possibly out Gallipoli. He also returned in 1919. Very, very difficult to get anything on him because apart from the fact that the Army Service Corps was the biggest single unit in the British Army in the First World War. It's far bigger than any individual regiment. Trying to trace somebody called John Murphy in the biggest single regiment, in the biggest single unit of the British Army is an absolute nightmare. So, as I say, only 2 men went out of over 50. So many went from Belfast Fire Brigade that they had to bring in a bylaw to prevent them leaving the brigade to join the army. They actually had to draft the RIC men, they had to draft 10 RIC men into Belfast and train them as firemen while new firemen were recruited. Cork City, a significant number of men went from Cork, which was a tiny brigade at the time. There was only 8 full-time, about 20 supernumeraries with them. I think a quarter of those went. There was a Cork fireman killed at Mons, which would mean that he had to be a reservist. He couldn't have joined the Munsters, been trained and been at Mons, been in action that early in the war. So he was obviously a reservist. The lack of people from the DMP going could be seen very much as, you can look at it a couple of ways. I mean, there was no economic reason for them to go. They were in good jobs. There was no economic pull. But equally, it can be looked at as a strongly trade union stance. The trade unions in Dublin, Connolly and the others, were very anti-recruiting. So it could be seen as a trade union stance in refusing to join. Now, in April of 1916, 24th of April 1916, there was a probationary fireman called Joseph Connolly on duty in Tallaght Street. He joined the brigade in 1915 and was a member of the Citizen Army, as were all his family. A group of ICA members crossed Buck Bridge that morning from Liberty Hall and called into Tallaght Street on the way to Dublin Castle and City Hall. The officer in charge, Sean Connolly, told his brother that the rising was going ahead. Joe had seen the countermanding order, thought the thing had been called off. He was on duty, so he stayed put. Sean called in and told him that he was needed. So he left Tallaght Street. He literally walked out of Tallaght Street, returned to the family home in what's now Sean McDermott Street, Lower Gloucester Street at the time. And he changed uniforms and went to Liberty Hall. On the way to Liberty Hall, he acquired a motor car because Joe was a driver, which was very, very rare skill. It was a rare enough skill in the fire brigade in those days, but a very, very rare skill within the Citizen Army, where very few of the members would have been qualified drivers. Joe, as I say, acquired a car somewhere between Sean McDermott Street and Liberty Hall. He didn't own a car. We know for a fact he didn't own a car. He did, however, own a Holt rifle, and that probably played some part in the acquisition of the motor car. He was never very clear about that. He drove supplies to the GPO, and he was there on the first night. We had him on the garrison there on the first night. Then he was sent to the College of Surgeons, and he fought there throughout Easter week with Malin and the Countess. His brother, of course, had gone to Dublin Castle. He'd killed the constable on the gate, and thereby inflicted the first Crown Forces casualty of the rising. In turn, he was shot shortly afterwards on the roof of City Hall by a sniper firing from Dublin Castle, and became the first Republican casualty of the rising. All the family, there were 5 brothers in total, including Sean and his sister, Katie Barrett, all Citizen Army members, all in action at that time. But with the exception of Joe was in the college, the rest of them were all in the City Hall garrison. Joe's mentioned in several accounts of the fighting in the College of Surgeons. He was sniping from the roof. He rescued a wounded volunteer who had been hit by machine gun fire, and he was involved in nursing Margaret Skinner when she was wounded in the raid on Harcourt Street. He surrendered as part of the garrison and was imprisoned in England. He was sent to Lincoln originally. He ended up in Frongach. After his release, he was reinstated in the Dublin Fire Brigade because he used the regulations which were brought in to encourage recruiting to the British forces to say that the job should have been held open for him. They had said in 1914 that if any man went to fight, his job would be held. By the time Joe came back, the political winds had changed, the feeling within Dublin Corporation had changed. He used that, he came back into the job, and he was reinstated with no questions asked. He then did something which, as a former shop steward in the Fire Brigade, I have to say I always have regarded with a great deal of awe. Joe used the same regulations to claim half pay for the period that he'd been locked up. And he got it. Now that's the story of one man. But for the brigade itself, go back to the 24th of April The first call of the day came in for a fire in the magazine fort in the Phoenix Park. Crew from Thomas Street under the Brigade second in command, Lieutenant Myers, attended that. On the way, an incident occurred which had an interesting sort of aftermath. In his report for the Irish Times record of the rebellion, Captain Purcell states that Myers and the crew were stopped and threatened with revolvers. Myers had written to the Times and publicly contradicted the chief officer on this, and this is within weeks of the rising. At the time when it was certainly not popular, and certainly not popular in the sort of circles that Myers moved in, he seemed to give any backing to the volunteers. He said that he'd been stopped by a volunteer officer to prevent his men going into a dangerous area and advised by him to use a different route. It would appear he was driving down the quays, was stopped before he drove into what would have been the kind of field of fire around the Mendicity Institution, and asked to take a different way. Myers actually, was quite generous in his description of the volunteers and thanked them for saving his men from going into trouble. It did cause a reaction with the chief and himself, and the chief officer Purcell definitely disagreed about that. As the day wore on, reports of fires came in from the city centre, and the brigade responded as best it could. The first fires of the rising that are recorded, and oddly enough, when we spoke about this, Sheila, earlier on, the occurrence book from Dublin Fire Brigade for Easter week was sold at auction last Saturday in town, and lucky enough, it was actually bought by Dublin City Archives, so it's coming home. It'll be digitalised and available to us all in the not too distant future, I hope. I had a chance to look at it, but I also have the annual report reproduced as an appendix within this book. The first fires in Dublin, first fires of the rising in Dublin, when people realised that the police were off the streets, that a revolution had started, that all the established orders were gone, looting began. And the first shops looted and the first shops burned were shoe shops, the Cable Shoe Company and the True Form Boots. When people had the city at their mercy and could have anything they wanted, they didn't go to the banks, they didn't go to the jewellers, they went to this unimaginable luxury. They got shoes for themselves. Now, those buildings were burned, and as buildings were being looted, they were being burned. Now, there's no kind of, I don't understand that, but I mean, it's a common reaction, and if you see it even in those riots in London a couple of years back, if you look at the riots that happened in the US, remember, after the Rodney King thing, it just seems to be a kind of a crowd instinct that looting is followed by burning. But in Dublin, certainly, as it's recorded in the Dublin Fire Brigade accordance book by the men who were there, the fires were being started by looters. They would spread. Military action as the week went on would help them to spread, because especially once artillery came into use, it blew in windows, it blew in doors, it knocked holes in slates roofs, so it encouraged the fire to spread. But the actual main fires were started by looters. There's a theory that Dublin was pounded with incendiary shells. There were no incendiary shells in 1916. The first incendiary shells that the British Army developed were in 1918, Pomeroy shells for firing at airships, which were raiding the UK at the time. Largely, the fires were, as I say, as a result of looting. The volunteers themselves, in holding strongholds, would mouse hole, as they call it, they'd tunnel between buildings. That would help the fires to spread. That's the map of the centre of Dublin. It was done by Purcell afterwards. The red areas are the burned out areas, and as you see, they burned. It's a fire without a fire brigade. They burned to the extremities of the fire breaks on the streets that they couldn't cross roads. That's the GPO and the area behind it. This across the road, this is what Ray the GPO here and here. Fires down here and across to the other side of Thomas Street, that's stretching back up the quays. But that's that area. This is the other area. These are the other fires that he specifically mentioned. The Linden Hall Barracks was up at the back of the forecourts. The forecourts garrison, that Daly's garrison would have seen it as a potential threat. In 1916, the Linden Hall wasn't in use as a military barracks. It was still a military post. There were office workers there. I think the Army Pay Corps was stationed there. But it offered a potential breach in their area. It offered a potential stronghold for the British troops coming in. It was decided to burn it. It burned spectacularly well, a bit too well, and spread to a
a chemical works in the area. So that created, quite a sight, I believe, by all accounts, as the chemicals burned off and exploded. It made an awful lot of noise in an area where an awful lot was happening. It actually got to the point that it lit the whole area up. It worked against the volunteers' best interest in the end, because it lit the place up for British soldiers. This one here is Clonwilliam House. That's the scene of the Mount Street Bridge here. Clonwilliam House is one of the outposts. One of the very few places that probably did go on fire through sheer military action, just the amount of lead poured into it, between hitting gas pipes, which would still have had some residual gas in them. The gasometer had been shut down by Portsmouth on the Monday, but the furniture and curtains and so forth went on fire, just as I said, the sheer amount of lead that was being poured in. The interesting thing there's Mount Street Bridge. You had, across here you had the schoolhouse, and you had Ballone's outpost down here. They were involved in fires as well. But the canal was the deciding line for Dublin Fire Brigade. Dublin Corporation ran the city within the canals. That was the Rathmines of Pembroke Township, and was therefore no business of the Dublin Fire Brigade. So it wasn't mentioned on the map at all. This is Harcourt Street. The Citizen Army in the College of Surgeons noticed that British troops were moving up Harcourt Street in order to deny them a base there. Margaret Skinner and a number of other Citizen Army members came down and set fire to buildings there. They were seen, one volunteer was killed there, Skinner was badly injured and brought back to the college, but there was a small fire. This fire is the fire that they started in Harcourt Street. Again, it's mentioned in the report that when the firemen arrived, they found a dead volunteer and ammunition there. This is an interesting fire. The forecourts were here on the Tuesday night into Wednesday morning of Easter week. A group of Dublin Fusiliers had taken this building here. That's the Brazen Head Hotel, just to kind of give you an idea where we're looking at. It gave them line of sight and line of fire into the forecourts complex. So they were regarded as a major threat to the garrison there. And during the Tuesday night into the early hours of Wednesday morning, two members, Heather Clancy and volunteer Tom Smart, crossed the bridge with cans of petrol or paraffin, set fire to the building here. Again, it burned spectacularly well and took quite a few buildings around it. They got back into the courts. Clancy, of course, would go on to feature on Bloody Sunday when he was killed in Dublin Castle with Dick McKay. The other thing, just to make the point, there is, as I said, this idea that the shelling started the fires, so automatically one followed the other. Liberty Hall, heavily shelled, pockmarked with shells, but no fire, because the fires had stopped. They'd been stopped by streets on the way. The fires that were burning up Beacon Quay had hit some natural fire breaks there and had to spread that far. So that building was absolutely pounded, both by an 18-pounder fired from Tallaght Street and by the Helga. There was no fire in Liberty Hall. Kelly's Fort, the gunpowder office on the corner of O'Connell Street, would be very much similar. Very heavily shelled, but again the fires didn't spread to it. Purcell was watching this from Tallaght Street from the tower, and he described it as the Great Fire. From Thursday, he speaks about the Great Fire. All the fires burning in the city centre are coalesced into one huge fire, a conflagration burning out of control. On Saturday, after the surrender, when he was given a go-ahead to put the brigade back on the streets, the immediate danger was to Jervis Street Hospital. The fire was spreading towards that. He mobilised all his own resources, and he also mobilised the fire service from Powers Whisky Distillery and from the Guinness Brewery. And they both had quite modern fire brigades at the time. They were brought in to help the Dublin Fire Brigade. He didn't ask for the Mines Fire Brigade to cross the canal, and he didn't ask the Pembroke Fire Brigade to cross the canal, because good people in Dublin would have had to pay for their services, whereas both Guinness and Powers were ratepayers within the city, so they provided the services for free. Just on a tail end of the 1916 Rising is something I came across last year. Dublin's warhorse, the Dublin Fire Brigade's warhorse. On the Wednesday of Easter week, a horse-drawn ambulance was called at Clarence Street near Boland's Mills. The Wednesday around Boland's Mills, this is the height of the Mount Street Cot.
So there's a huge amount of fighting going on. A woman had been shot in the area, and the ambulance was called from Harris Street to go down and deal with it. While they were dealing with the casualty, there was additional firing, and a civilian who was helping the fireman was hit, and the horse was hit. Now this was quite serious because fire brigade horses were very expensive. It took a long time to train them, and they were very highly regarded both by the chief officer and by the corporation, probably more highly regarded than most of the firemen. The man in charge of Michael Kavanagh now had a problem because he had to write to the chief officer and explain how one of the horses had managed to get shot under his care. And I seen a copy of the letter last year, and it's very, very good. Now I hope for his sake that it was a rough draft, because according to the report he was sending in to the chief, trying to downplay the incident obviously, he said that the horse called Bertie had been shot in the arm. It wasn't a very serious wound, it was a wound in the arm. Bertie was brought back. He was able to limp up to the central fire station in Tallaght Street, where he was left for treatment, at which point the two human casualties were dealt with. Captain Purcell retired due to an injury in 1917, and the command of the brigade was given to John Myers, the man I spoke of earlier, who was involved in the incident in 1916. Recruiting was carried out due to improvements in working conditions, and a number of men joined, including James Conway in 1918, Thomas Smart, Austin MacDonald, James Rogers and Thomas Kavanagh in 1920. All were members of the IRA. Smart had fought in the Rising. Smart was the man who set fire to the building across from the forecourts. He was a fireman's son. His father was a fireman in Buckingham Street. He fought through the Rising in the forecourts in North King Street area. Austin MacDonald had just been released from Mountjoy prison. He was West Mayo Brigade IRA. He'd just been released for assaulting members of the RSC. He'd served 6 months for that. The idea that somebody could be taken into the fire brigade who'd served any time in prison is unheard of. Myers recruited him straight from Mountjoy. He also recruited Tom Kavanagh, who also served 6 months. Tom Kavanagh was another 1916 veteran who fought with Colbert in Watkins Brewery. He had served 6 months for illegal drilling. He was in the 4th Battalion. A number of them were arrested in sandpits up at Ballyfermot. The Ballyfermot area would have been a very rural area at the time and was used extensively by the 4th Battalion for training. The sandpits were also used for target practice from time to time. As I say, you had the situation where these men were coming in. They had to be known to Myers, the big active Republicans, the active members of the IRA. They were certainly well known to the police. These are men who served sentences and would have been 1916 veterans who were very much under the eye of the police. It brings a situation where, this is Tom Smart in his volunteer uniform. As I said, Tom would go on to serve many years in the Dublin Fire Brigade as his father had before him, and as his son later would, as the number of us would have worked with his son. That's his father here. He's the coachman in Buckingham Street Fire Station. Now, as I say, for these men to come into the Dublin Fire Brigade, the only person who could allow them in, who would sign off and come in, was Captain Myers, John Myers. Now, Myers himself is an interesting man. He's a relation. He would be the grand uncle of Kevin Myers, the journalist. But had a different view of the national question, as people might call it. Captain Myers had been a donor to a Fenian memorial in 1905, but 2 particular incidents throw a lot of light on him. In 1920, at the Rathmines church fire, he was called in to assist with the Rathmines Fire Brigade. The church went on fire in, I think it was January 1920. Dublin Fire Brigade weren't allowed to deal with it because it was in the township. People speak of seeing the Dublin firemen sit on the bridge at Rathmines and enjoy the spectacle of the church burning because it wasn't their fire. The chief of Rathmines very quickly asked them to assist. When they did, Captain Myers, as the senior officer, took charge. As soon as he did, he was approached by a local volunteer officer who explained that the sacristan of the church was also the quartermaster of the local IRA unit and had arms and ammunition stored in the vaults under the church. Myers put Dublin Fire Brigade members, as they were described, sympathetic Dublin Fire Brigade members, in charge of the area,
and arranged for the volunteers to enter and remove all traces of the arms dump before the fire was declared out and returned to the Rathmines Township Brigade. The volunteer officer writing about this, the Bureau of Military History, describes Captain Myers as being a man with a good national outlook. I'm old enough to remember, but that was the only accolade that any politician in this country ever needed, that they had a good national outlook. Another incident happened shortly afterwards. There was an arms raid at Kingsbridge train station. An IRA unit disarmed a guard of 10 soldiers, took their rifles and set fire to train carriages which were carrying military equipment and stores. When the fire brigade arrived, they refused to put out the fire, and Captain Myers actually mentions in the annual report that he decided not to put this fire out because it was a military action by the IRA. The railwaymen were in dispute. At the time, a lot of railwaymen had been laid off. They were refusing to carry military stores, and it was an action also in sympathy with them. And he also said basically that it was the job of the military to fight their own fires. So Dublin Fire Brigade stood by. There's a photograph in the book which I got from Tom Smart's son. His father is in it. Tom Smart, you can identify a number of the IRA men within the brigade. The photograph, it was taken from an American newspaper, and it shows them basically leaning back against the fire engine while the carriages blaze. It was a very high profile act, and oddly enough it's actually mentioned when the British Army reported the fire. They say they do actually mention that the fire brigade arrived and refused to deal with it. The fact that that didn't sort of strike them as odd strikes me as very odd. Within the city, this group of people began to organise sympathisers within the job. There were other IRA men there. There were quite a number of people who were, although not sworn volunteers, were very, very actively sympathetic to it. Tom Smart, again, in his statement for the 1944 of the 1944 pension statement, which has been released recently, speaks about this, and he says that in the entire brigade there were possibly 2 men who, as he put it, had to be dealt with, had to be spoken to allow them to get on with what they were doing. This is a brigade, as I say, 50 to 60 men and an officer corps working down from Captain Myers down to junior officers, who were basically, at this stage, the Dublin Fire Brigade had become subverted to the Republic because it was being actively used by IRA intelligence officers. Men within the brigade were in a position, because they could operate outside of curfew, they were in a position to see who else was operating outside of curfew, what houses were lit up at night, where people were coming and going. You have evidence of fire brigade vehicles, and especially ambulances, being used to move arms and equipment around the city. One particular ambush on the Malahide Road, the arms were moved into position the day before by a fire brigade ambulance left in a safe house in a dump. The ambush went ahead. The men were able to move in unarmed, get their arms on the spot, carry out the ambush. The arms are dumped back in the safe house. So even if they're stopped on the way back to the city, they're unarmed. The fire brigade ambulance is sent along later that night on a sick call to the house and removes the arms and equipment, and they're brought back into an IRA dump. If wounded volunteers who were dealt with by the ambulance were searched and any arms, ammunition or documents removed before they were brought to a sympathetic hospital, usually the Mater seems to have been, any IRA casualties were brought to the Mater regardless of whether they were picked up in the city. There was an arrangement obviously with the Mater. The same system worked kind of in reverse in that men shot by the volunteers could also be searched for documents if they were unconscious or if they were dead. The first shooting of a DMP G-man by the squad, who was Smith in Drumcondra in 1919, when he was shot, one of the crewmen on the ambulance which arrived was Joe Connolly, the fireman we spoke about, the Citizen Army man. He was able to report back to Joe Lawless that Smith wasn't dead. Smith did later die of his wounds, but it refined the tactics of the squad in terms of the type of weapon that was being used. They up-armoured and began to use 45s rather than 38s, which they'd used earlier. That's Captain Myers, that's John Myers there. That photograph is taken slightly after the period, that's at the start of the Civil War, but there are very, very few photographs of him in existence. That's the crew in Tallaght Street in 1921. If you bear with me for a second, it's part of the crew, not the entire crew now, it would have been just a duty crew. It's a random photograph, but if we just
bear with me as I say, I'll run through it with you. The men involved here are on the back.
Austin MacDonald, West Mayo Brigade IRA, as I say, had served a 6 month prison sentence before he came in. When he came to Dublin, he joined the 4th Battalion and was a very active volunteer. At this stage in 1920, the brigade had moved so far from our 7 days a year off. Firemen worked 48 hours on and 24 off. Now, on those days off, you find men taking part in arms raids, you find them taking part in ambushes, you find them taking part in all sorts. As I say, MacDonald, McKeown, I have material on McKeown at the forecourts at the start of the Civil War with Joe Connolly on an ambulance couriering material and messages in and out of the courts. Very definitely involved in the Republican movement. The next man here, Keane, is mentioned as an IRA intelligence officer, and specifically is mentioned in connection with the Bloody Sunday shootings. Again, on the morning of Bloody Sunday, the ambulance crew who were going to be going to the officers' houses and will presumably have access to them, both to the houses and to the men themselves for searching, are Michael Buckley and Joe Connolly. Of the crew in Tallaght Street, of this random photograph, half the men in it are either Irish Republican Army or Irish Citizen Army. That's John Murphy, that's the man I mentioned earlier who joined the Army Service Corps. And Ned Doyle. The others, Kane, Barton and Seaver, no evidence there, just as I say, the brigade was completely, by this stage, completely subverted, for want of a better word, sympathisers and active sympathisers. I have no idea who that child is because his name is here, but there's no one by that name in the Fire Brigade, so he just wandered into the picture. Now, as I say, arms could be moved about, because I mean, if you think about it, what's a more innocent vehicle than an ambulance? Even today, if you see an ambulance on the street going about its business, you'll make way for it to let them past you. It's the same in 1920 and 1921. They'd been waved through checkpoints. If they weren't waved through checkpoints, again, it's funny when you look back on some of the statements that are made. On one case, an ambulance that was carrying material was stopped, and the lads told the soldiers to go ahead and search it. They just dealt with a typhoid case. They weren't getting into the back of the soldiers. So they were waved through as well. After an ambush in Brunswick Street, Pearse Street, the night that Traynor was hanged in Mountjoy, there was an ambush. McBride led an ambush down there. It was seen as imperative after an execution that there was a hit back, a very quick, hard hit back. He led an ambush in auxiliaries. One of the men involved threw a grenade at an auxiliary tender, which either exploded as he threw it or hit the tender and bounced back, but it blew his leg off. Now, he was brought to hospital, his leg was saved, and he was brought to hospital by Tom Kavanagh, the man we mentioned earlier, who was another 1916 veteran, very much involved in all this. When he brought him to Mercer's Hospital, which would have been a distance away from there, and explained to the doctors and nurses that the poor unfortunate man had run over by a tram, which accounted for the missing leg. At this stage as well, IRA activities, the incendiary war within Dublin was starting to build up. They began to burn British tax offices. Again, that's facilitated by members within the Dublin Fire Brigade completing the work and the staff being evacuated. All it takes is men to go in, start a fire, the place is evacuated, the fire brigade arrive and get on. And the largest attack of this kind, and the one where Dublin Fire Brigade members totally crossed the line with being active participants, is the Custom House burning on the 25th of May 1921. Austin MacDonald, this man here, in his accounts, mentions, he's disappeared, I'll get him back, there he is, mentions that he was approached by members of the Dublin Brigade with a view to finding out how his recommendations for burning the Custom House. If MacDonald, who would have been a relatively new fireman at the time, was involved, others certainly were, and Joe Connolly again speaks of his involvement in planning the burning of the Custom House. They had to explain to the 2nd Battalion who were going to do it how it should be carried out. It's a big stone building, it's a difficult building to burn. One of the things that the firemen insisted on, and that Oscar Traynor afterwards insisted on always, was that they'd use paraffin rather than petrol. The reason for that being, people were familiar with paraffin in those days. They used paraffin lamps and paraffin heaters. They understood paraffin, they understood how it burned. Petrol, most people didn't drive or have any experience of cars. They had very little experience of petrol. Petrol, if used badly, will set off The fumes of petrol are more dangerous than the petrol itself. And there were a number of cases of volunteers being killed, including one very badly injured up at Crumlin RAC barracks when it was being burned out, because they'd spread the petrol and then light the fire some moments later, but it created an explosive mix. Around the country, a number of volunteers were killed and badly burned from that. So that was one of the things for the custom house that they recommended the paraffin be used. The other issue was to hold up the fire stations, because the custom house, regardless, it still needed a head start to get it burning. They were going to take it over at 1 o'clock in the day. The idea was that they could take over a major government building in the centre of Dublin. The thinking behind it, supposedly the Valera's theory behind it, was that it would move the war onto an international stage, that this wasn't an ambush, and this couldn't be written off as, thuggery or terrorism. This was going to be a major attack. There were 6 major stations, fire stations, that had to be dealt with. The 4 city stations of Tallaght Street, Buckingham Street, Dorset Street and Thomas Street, and the 2 townships stations at Mines and Pembroke. Each one was detailed off to a particular unit other than the 2nd Battalion unit. The 2nd Battalion, where Tom Ennis's men were going to burn the custom house, along with members of the squad and the service unit. In the case of Thomas Street, it was held up by C Company, the 4th Battalion, Rathmines by G Company, the 4th. One of the members of G Company, his father was a fireman in Rathmines, so he would have been very familiar with the routine of the station. Dorset Street, held up by the 1st Battalion, D Company. Pembroke by D Company, the 3rd Battalion. Tallaght Street, the big one that had to be held, and held for 20 to 25 minutes, was held by K Company of the 3rd Battalion. They entered the station, they immobilised the fire engines. They actually didn't. They didn't need to immobilise the fire engines, because most of the firemen were active volunteers, were working with them. They held the station for 25 minutes. They had firemen answer the calls which were coming in from the police and from the auxiliaries to say that the custom house was on fire. They knew the routine to use to tell them that the escape was on the way, the motor was being turned out. In 1948 there was a reunion of K Company, and I've had a copy of the booklet, and in it the officer commanding K Company thanked the IRA intelligence officers within the Dublin Fire Brigade for all their help in taking over the stations. In Tallaght Street's case, they left the station, they literally pulled out the front gates as auxiliaries were coming in the back gate to find out why they hadn't arrived. They were driven away by Joe Connolly, and they were got safely away. At that point, the Fire Brigade went to the custom house to attend it. That photograph was taken in the very early stages, literally as the Fire Brigade arrived. This is one of Corson's turntable ladders. There was 2 motor engines were sent to it as well, Thomas Street, Tallaght Street, and the Brigade's turntable ladders were sent. Myers did not send for the township brigades. He didn't request their help. He didn't request Guinness. He didn't request Powers Distillery brigades either. He didn't request help from any of the military fire brigades, which would have been in every barracks, and he didn't request the help of the Curragh Camp Fire Brigade, which was quite an advanced brigade at the time and had a railway siding which could bring men and material there. As I say, this is probably one of the very early photographs. The building is burning well here. You have thick black smoke coming out here. This area of the building is burning very, very well at this stage. They have a major fire in their hands. That's the centrepiece. This is taken, if you were looking at this, you'd have Busaurus at the back of you. It's on that side of the thing. If you look here, there's no wisp of smoke. That part of the building isn't burning at all. All the fires confined here. Within hours, that building would be totally ablaze. And the only thing that's added to the building, the only thing that's added to the scene from here to the situation 2 hours later when it's blazing, is the Dublin Fire Brigade. What happened was when the men went inside the building, they discovered cans of paraffin which had been abandoned by members of the 2nd Battalion as they evacuated the building, and the shooting outside started. And the firemen took that paraffin and spread the fire through the rest of the building. They had complete access to it. The military were outside. There was still a gun battle going on in the quays. The firemen had complete access to the building. several of them, Tom Kavanagh, Jim Conway, Mick Rogers, talk about going through the building and burning, spreading that fire through this whole area and into all the other areas. They were also able to get in and go through the documents that were there, open strong boxes and spread those out as well. Most of the documents in the Custom House were local government. The local government board was based there. So a lot of their documents, a lot of taxation documents as well. And also at the time it was being used to amass all the documentation that they needed to set up the 6-county state. It was being gathered there before it was sent on to Belfast. That was all burned in this. Mike Roger talks about it. And one of the biggest, several others, and this is well documented, two major parts that the firemen played was one in spread. The second battalion burned the Custom House, there's no question about that. That's who started the fire. It wouldn't have burned without them. It probably wouldn't have burned as effectively without the efforts of the firemen, because they went, as I say, they made sure that the fire was spread to the building. There's some great Pathé newsreel, if you ever see it, of the Custom House fire, which shows Dublin firemen in action. And there are several firemen with full blasts of hose going, and they're hitting the walls and they're hitting the pavements. And I don't think there's one of them going through the window actually into the fire. The other thing they did is they recovered weapons. When the Custom House was being burned, a patrol of auxiliaries arrived on scene. The gun battle broke out. A lot of the lads inside abandoned and tried to come out with the civilians to get away through the British lines. A lot of weapons were lost in there. The firemen began to gather the weapons, and I was just reading a statement the other night. One of the things that they found in there was 4 IRA volunteers still hiding in there. They'd been trapped within the building when the fire started, and when the gunfire outside started. When they were found some hours later, around 4 o'clock, Michael Rogers was sent back to Tallaght Street to gather some spare uniforms, which he brought in, and they were dressed in those uniforms and brought back as casualties when we got back to Tallaght Street, got through British lines. Another one of the uniforms was loaned then to a man called Michael O'Kelly, who was a captain in the Citizen Army. He went in and with Joe Connolly and Jim Conway and others organised the removal of weapons from there. Well documented, 35 plus himself, Connolly and Conway took out. Others speak of taking out 4, 5, up to 10 weapons. Fair estimate, 40 plus weapons came out. Now, 80 men were captured, and there's always the thing, the disaster of the Custom House, that 80 men are captured, a number are killed, that it destroyed the IRA in Dublin. It destroyed the 2nd Battalion. The other battalions were in action that day. They were in the fire stations. They were there. They lost nobody at it. Squad and ASU were badly damaged here as well. And the other thing people say is that there wasn't a gun left in the Dublin Brigade afterwards. As I say, upwards of 40 guns these are all pistols and revolvers, were recovered by these men and got back by that night via ambulance, as it happens, to the brigade quartermaster. There's actually one man speaks about a bedroom in Tallaght Street, one of the firemen's bedrooms in Tallaght Street, being used to clean and check the weapons before they returned, so that they were ready for action as soon as they went back. The Custom House, as I say, is a big one. There was a second fire within 2 weeks in Dublin, and it's actually forgotten. And it's only in the last couple of days I've been writing about it for a book on the Custom House that I'm working on at the moment. I'm only beginning to realise the significance of it. On the 3rd of June, there was an arson attack on the National Shell Factory, which was down across from Kingsbridge Station. It's still there. The outline of it is still there.
Hickey's in there.
Who's in there now?
Hickey's, I think.
Hickey's, the very big, yeah. Hickey's there now. During the First World War, it had operated as a shell factory making munitions. After the First World War, it was taken over by the Royal Army Service Corps and used as their vehicle depot, both for maintenance and for vehicles that were being sent out of the country. In the run-up to the Custom House, you see a pattern developing in Dublin of incendiary attacks on British military transport. These are individual trucks getting burned out on railway sidings. Some of them are burned out where soldiers have left them to carry out raids or whatever. 4 to 5 trucks are burned in the weeks leading up to this. Now, that seems like it's a feeble, it's nothing. But if you think about it, every vehicle that's burned in Dublin is a vehicle that can't raid in Roscommon. It's a vehicle that can't carry a patrol in Mayo. It's a vehicle that can't supply an RAC barracks in Galway. It's
hitting them hard because these vehicles have to be replaced. The request to replace them have to go back to the UK. At the time, the British Army is involved in Iraq, in Palestine, in Afghanistan, in various places where motor transport was at a premium. So by destroying a truck, the knock-on effect is actually quite serious. On the 3rd of June, the shell factory was born by 2 3rd Battalion members who worked there. They set up a simple incendiary device before they left work. 40 trucks were burned. 40 vehicles were burned, including 5 Peerless armoured cars. Now, the Peerless were being sent over to back up the Rolls Royce armoured cars. They were, you'd see them, anyone familiar with the period, the big double turreted armoured cars, you see a lot of them being used during the Civil War, and then were passed over. There was no incident in the War of Independence. There was no incident through the whole revolutionary period where 5 armoured cars were destroyed. There was no ambush for 5 armoured cars. The only time that I can think that an armoured car was even captured was the raid for Mountjoy, for the attempt to take McKeown out of Mountjoy. They did capture 1 armoured car for that. But to lose 5 armoured cars and 35 other vehicles was a huge blow to British military transport. Again, I was just reading the British report on it, and they mentioned that the cost of vehicles was £212,000, and there was another 20-odd thousand, so nearly $250,000. Huge money. And not even just the financial blow, but the logistical blow that this would have meant. The Fire Brigade did, of course, turn up and save the petrol stores. And I'm inclined to think that they might have saved the petrol stores on the basis that the petrol stores went up, there were several fire brigades went up with it. So certainly they make no effort to save any of the 40 vehicles. You go from there, you go into the truce, and oddly enough, the Fire Brigade featured there for the simple reason that we used at the Mansion House to police the peace conference, because the Republican police weren't acceptable to the British, the RSC or DMP weren't acceptable to the Republicans. People used, they thought the uniformed public servants would be acceptable to both sides, and in footage of it, you see firemen stewarding those meetings. And oddly enough, most of the firemen you see were also volunteers. so maybe Michael Collins might have had an ear in there as well. You go from there into the truce, and that whole uneasy peace. The next time that there's any kind of kick-off again is with the start of the Civil War the following year. When the Civil War starts, when the attack goes in on the forecourts, 2 firemen leave Tallaght Street and report to the Republican forces. Joe Connolly, again, as he did in 1916, leaves and reports to the Republican forces. Austin MacDonald also reports back to the 4th Battalion and goes into action in the block. Now, Connolly is ordered, and I actually have the piece of paper here. It's not on the slide, but I have the piece of paper here if anybody wants to see it. Connolly was ordered by Oscar Traynor on the first day of the Civil War, the day the attack starts, to leave O'Connell Street, to return to the Fire Brigade, and to go back into undercover work within the Dublin Fire Brigade. He's to take an ambulance to the courts because a number of Republican prisoners are badly injured, and he's to demand that these prisoners are handed over to him. And he did. And a number of ambulances went in and out, and they're recorded on both sides. A number of ambulances went in and out of the forecourts through the shelling to remove wounded members. Paddy O'Brien, who was the officer commanding, was wounded. Ernie O'Malley took over at that stage. O'Brien was taken out by Connolly and another fireman, brought for medical treatment and then smuggled through Free State lines to get him away. They also brought, they were acting as couriers, they were carrying messages from outside in. Another fireman that was involved there, Jack Darman, in his witness statement talks about taking men out as casualties who weren't injured but were specialists who would be required outside. They didn't want to lose them in any surrender there. After the courts fell, the fight moved to O'Connell Street, down to the block in O'Connell Street, and again there are reports of Fire Brigade ambulances evacuating people from there. That kind of cuts across 2 things. That's Oscar Traynor, that's for Tom Smart for his pension application, and it mentions both the removal of guns from the Custom House, but also the fact that at the start of the Civil War he was sent to Blessington
to carry messages to to Jerry Boland, which he did by. Now, I never figured this one out. As I say, Dublin Corporation operated within the canals. How we managed to justify a Dublin Fire Brigade ambulance wandering around Wicklow and nobody brought any suspicion on it, I don't know. After this, you had a situation where, after the fall of the block, the Battle of Dublin, I suppose, that's taken in Garden Street. That's just when the fighting's gone on in O'Connell Street. They've had to withdraw. The reason there's so many men on here is that they've had to abandon equipment in O'Connell Street because of the level of fire, and they were waiting for the ceasefire to go back in. After this period, you see that the men drop off. There is no active Republican fighting really within Dublin. It's become a much smaller war. It's back to the hit and run, and it's back again to incendiary attacks. In December, after the killings in Mountjoy, after the reprisal shootings in Mountjoy of Barrett and McKelvey and Mellows and O'Connor, there's an attack within 2 days by Republicans in the city on the homes of TDs and senators. And in one case, J.J. McGarry's house at Louisburg Avenue, they used petrol, they set fire to the house, and 2 children were trapped. One of McGarry's children was born to death. A number of men. I find nobody beyond that period involved. And even in going through the paperwork, some of them simply just don't discuss it after that. Others actually make a point that, you know, they left. MacDonald talks about being sickened by the fratricidal strife. So they went on. At the end, in 1923, the only action taken against anybody by Captain Myers in relation to this, as I say, another 2 firemen had gone off to fight. One of them had come back. Both of them came back after the evacuation of the block. MacDonald had simply returned to the fire brigade and gone back on duty. The only action taken against him at any stage through this period was in 1923. Dublin Corporation approved a bonus of £5 for every fireman who'd been on duty through that week. And Captain Myers was asked to submit a report naming all the men. And the only disciplinary action I found through the whole revolutionary period, he left MacDonald and Connolly's name off the list, so they didn't get the fiver. MacDonald went on in later years to be the senior fire prevention officer in Dublin Fire Brigade, having in his youth planned the boarding of several parts of the city. And Joe Connolly in 1928 became chief officer of the Dublin Fire Brigade. So there may be a lesson there for us all. If there's a revolution, we should head off and make it. It just works wonders for your career prospects. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.
Any questions, folks? Any questions? This is the man who asked.
That shell factory, is that where Cal's, the printers, is or was?
I know Hickey's is there now. It's just across. It's across the river from Kingsbridge Station.
Oh, yeah.
Just as you go over the bridge and board, it's there.
Kind of a tour of it. You see the Cormans lined up on it there, drying themselves on.
It was Cal's, the printers at one stage.
Yeah, it's a huge. If you go into it, it's a huge footprint of land in there, and you can still see the kind of military influence in the place. It must have been. I mean, it wasn't built during the First World War. It became the shell factory, but it must have been a military installation of some kind prior to that.
Anyone else?
It's amazing the British, you know, if they were aware of the infiltration.
That's the bit that sounds amazing, and I think the only explanation at the custom house actually, Tom Smart was pulled out of line by an auxiliary for searching. At the time, he said he was carrying 4 weapons under his tunic. And another fireman, one of the foreman from Thomas Street, Charles McCullough, pulled him back out of the line and told him to get in, that he was needed on a hose. So he walked in and dumped the guns inside. Why he came to suspicion, I don't know. At the Four Courts, Paddy Daly called Tom Smart aside and told him that he knew what he was doing and that he did not see him or do his back there. Now, that was in the very early days of the Civil War, maybe 6 months later. That might have been a totally different outcome. As far as the British are concerned, I don't know. The only explanation I can find is that the British regarded this as just an insurgency. They believe their own propaganda. This is an insurgency. These are terrorists, these are gunmen. The vast majority of people want to see the back of them, support British rule, and how possibly could these uniformed civil servants, people who are like us,
just in a different uniform. How could they support this? It was beyond the kind of British military mindset to see that could, because if you accept that, you have to accept the whole kind of legitimacy of the position that they're in. So I think it just didn't dawn on them. It just was beyond them to see that whole kind of counter state that was drawn up around them, that subversion that had taken over.
Can you explain that half pay again? You're talking about.
Yeah, in 1914, the Dublin Corporation, to encourage members to join the British forces, brought in quite a number of fellas. I think about 70 corporation staff went immediately because they were reservists. They had no choice in it. If you were in the Army Reserve, you went. But to encourage other staff to join, they brought in a regulation which held your job open for you when you returned, that you were entitled to returned at no loss of service, and that they would continue members on half pay. As far as I understand, married men, their families were paid half pay during the period they were away, and single men could claim the half pay when they came back. It wasn't actually paid to anybody, it was banked for them, or nominally banked for them, if you like. Now, it might have been just the corporal being smart on the basis that they wouldn't all come back, so they wouldn't have to pay everybody. But that was, that was in place.
It could have made the average fellow pretty rich down in
A lot of Guinness done the same. A lot of building firms and industrial firms and business houses around the city and banks done exactly the same thing. Yeah, that was quite. Brigades writes about it in his City in Wartime. He's very good on it. He's a good section on that. Quite a number of businesses did it to encourage people to go.
No, I'm actually reading First World War books at the moment.
Right.
And none of them.
Yeah.
That's the first time I've heard it mentioned.
Yeah.
Jacob biscuit factories everywhere.
Yeah, but that's quite.
I'm expecting short war too.
That's it. It was going to be up by Christmas, you know. So I mean, you could afford to lose a load of the staff for 6 months. You'll be back in January. Sorry.
At the time of the fire in the customs house, was the census forms held there at that time?
Not the government authority. I'm not sure where they held it. I know the census forms. I think the census forms were lost in the forecourts.
Yeah.
They were in the forecourt.
Yeah.
They were only
I think it was taxation records mainly that were held there.
Oh,
But
right.
again, one of the things Rogers talks about in terms of the custom house is it's in the book here. As the evening wore on, as this kind of gun battle had stopped, people had been arrested, were being processed. The auxiliaries took over Liberty Hall as a headquarters to work out of. And he was saying, like, as he wrote it in 1960, he wrote a piece in a newspaper about it. He was saying, like, as that evening went on, and darkness came and the custom house was blazing, someone among the auxiliaries decided that they should search the place, just in case any IRA were hiding. They had been, but they were long gone at this stage. But he said that they paid particular attention to the bonded warehouse and removed several cases of brandy for safekeeping in case they tried to get out. So they opened the number. Some of them were sent back to Beggar's Bush, and others were opened and passed around. And he did say, in fairness to them, that they were very generous. They passed them to the firemen as well. There were Guinness casks on the quays to which had been abandoned when the shooting started. So they raided the pub and they got those out. Then his abiding memory of the custom house fire was in the very early hours of the morning. A number of the auxiliaries who had searched Liberty Hall had found band instruments belonging to the Transport and General Workers Union. And a number of the more musically inclined members of the auxiliary division had set up on the steps of Liberty Hall and given them a rousing rendition to keep the home fires burning. So he enjoyed that, but then a row started over who was the best shot. And apparently the Aussies sorted that out by drawing the revolvers and shooting out any windows that were left. So he said they were quite happy to get away at that stage. But yeah, it's an interesting thing. That's the one. The custom house is the one where they totally cross the line and they become combatants, really. It's not just a matter of turning a blind eye. It's not a matter of giving a helping hand. It's not a matter of moving equipment. No matter that day, they're actually, to all intents and purposes, they're combatants. There's much participants in that attack. And really, Captain Myers was injured during it, and he withdrew from it. But it was in Myers' power to, I won't say to put the fire out, but certainly to vastly curtail the damage done by that fire. And it was Myers' decision not to do that. Now, it was at a much lower level within the brigade that IRA members were actually going inside and spreading that fire. But I mean, at command level, at Myers level, the levy's outside, you know, it's not a shortage of water. You could send 200 fellas with buckets would have put it out.
He was more heavily involved than you were.
He was more, yeah, and in later years, he was chief until 1927. After the Civil War, he, a good number of anti-treaty IRA men found jobs in Dublin Fire Brigade. At a time when anti-treaty Republicans couldn't get a job in this country, quite a number of them came in, some of them straight from the prison camps. He was replaced by a man called John Power in 1927. He was only chief for a year. He had come through the ranks. He was the first fireman to come through the ranks. He'd been very involved in the union. He recruited a couple of ex-IRA, and he was replaced in his turn by Joe Connolly, who fought in 16. And through Connolly's time in the 30s, especially with the change of government in 32, you see them. But it, late 20s to the mid 30s, near enough to a quarter of Dublin Fire Brigade had anti-treaty service, and no, not one had fought on the Free State side, not one had fought on the pro-treaty side. So it was a kind of a little haven of republicanism. But of course, the Free State government had overruled the corporation in 1923 and put a commissioner into Dublin because they said they couldn't deal with the corporation. Ernest Lloyd said the Dublin Corporation was a haven of Reds and diehards, and he wasn't giving government money to it. He put a commissioner into it. Sorry, I'm starting another talk altogether there. I beg your pardon.
Is there have you any knowledge of Kevin Myers' feelings on?
Kevin actually done a very nice review. He done a full-page review of the book in History of Ireland, and he spoke glowingly of the book. He wasn't overly impressed with himself, now in fairness, but he felt my sympathies were too much on display, which is good coming from Kevin Myers. He says that within the family it's felt that the incident in 1916 that happened as Horsell described it and not as Myers described it. But Myers wrote to the press, he put his career on the line to defend the volunteers. He had, as I say, he could have him making contributions to a Field Memorial in 1905. In 1920, Rathmines Church, he hides in Armsville, and shortly after that he goes to, as I say, to King's Bridge and stands by for the Wagoners military equipment board. It's a small brigade. There are a small number of officers. Myers would know every man who was recruiting them who had 1916 service or prison service. He knew exactly what was going on. He couldn't not know what was going on. There was only 4 stations. Everyone was on continuous duty. He knew every man in the brigade. So it would be inconceivable that Myers... It couldn't have happened without Myers turning a blind eye to it at the very least. No evidence that he actively encouraged it, but he certainly did nothing to discourage it. And certainly there was never, sole exception of not putting the lads forward for the bonus, there was no action ever taken against any Republicans within the church at that whole period. Or indeed, as I say, in the years afterwards, up to 1927, when he would have found no shortage of support to have cleared people out of the job for sympathies like that. So no, I don't think myself and Kevin will ever agree on it.
But Kevin Myers was one of the first to campaign for the First World War veterans.
Yes.
Make them acceptable here in Dublin.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a turnabout from somebody who come from a Republican family.
Yeah,
to actually do
Kevin Myers as a student was quite a radical, you know, if you read his stuff, you know, he went to Belfast as a mini reporter.
To me, he was an open mind. He would look at cars and see it as it was. As weird as it could be at times.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know them. I've never met him. I don't know them. My own view, like I wouldn't agree with him on all that he does, but I think he's a controversialist.
Yeah.
He takes an opposite view to a lot of things.
No,
and
just
has made a
he was
career
brave
out of that. And
when he took on the cause of these men who went and fought for king and country, and were shunted back, and we had to leave the country in that.
Yeah, well, I know that theory, and I know my own family, my wife's grandfather would have been with the Dublin Fusiliers at Gallipoli in the Somme and Passchendaele, the Dublin man from Cornmarket. He was never forgotten in our family. And you know, there isn't a Church of Ireland within the city that doesn't have a memorial. There isn't a section of the city, I'd nearly say, that doesn't have a memorial. Be it memorial halls, be it church clocks, be it things. In the 30s, up to the 30s, there would have been very big Armistice Day parades, and it was hijacked politically in those days, and it wasn't hijacked necessarily by people who were, members of the British Legion or anything like this. You had people like the Blue Shirts and like the British Union of Fascists who got very much involved in there. They were only banned at that stage. De Valera was the one who gave the go-ahead for the Memorial Gardens down below. It's a two-sided story. I'm not saying one way or the other. I'm saying it's a two-sided story. We've gone from looking at black to looking at white, and we forget there's
But
always
what
an
I'm
awful
saying
lot
is
of
that he
grey.
put his head over the parapet when it was unpopular to do it here in the city, even at the time.
Yeah. But like I said, I think I don't read his column too often, but from what I do see of it, he likes putting his head over the parapet. And, that's what he does. That's
But it was
his
a good cause.
thing. Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's 90 years
The
ago.
O'Kelly that you
They should all be remembered, all sides of it.
Yeah. The O'Kelly that you talk about, is he related to Sean T. O'Kelly?
No, this guy was Michael O'Kelly. He was a captain in the Citizen Army. He would have been down on the docks. After 1916, the Citizen Army stayed. People think the Citizen Army became part of the IRA. The Citizen Army stayed as a separate group. Like you could argue that the Citizen Army fired its last shots in Spain in the 40s. But certainly at that period, the Citizen Army was operating as kind of part of quartermaster corps to all intents and purposes. Because of the Union connections, they had very strong connections on the docks. So they were able to arrange smuggling of weapons and so forth in. And they were also very heavily involved in intelligence. But individuals within the Citizen Army who wanted a more active role just transferred themselves into IRA units. So even some of the Conleys would have gone over to... Joe Conley didn't, he stayed at the Citizen Army throughout. And after 1916, he was active in a number of things, but on a kind of on a freelance basis with IRA units. But he stayed with the Citizen Army and fought with them. And the Citizen Army fought in the tramway office in O'Connell Street in 1922 at the start of the Civil War. That was their garrison there. They very quickly, as the Civil War degenerated, they very quickly stepped away from it.
Yeah.
But they were still, they were still there. They were still quite a potent force. They didn't disappear in 1916 by any means.
This was your Lawrence Police Station. At the time of the burning of the church, Enoch Tomas, his father was a station officer.
That's right, James Hillett. James Hillett
Would
Thomas.
he be active in
I don't know. And I'm thought it's funny. Shane McNamara got to go to and launch this here 2 years ago. And we were talking about that. We often spoke about his grandfather. And I remember Eamon McNamara got to go to him talking 2 years ago about it. Yeah, Eamon's father was James Heather Thomas. He was the station officer. He joined there as a fireman. He was a motor driver. And again, this thing of motor driving was like black magic.
with the back of the station?
That's right. They lived around Gulliston and all around there. Yeah. No, I don't think so. Now I know Eamon was very much involved from a youth, but I mean his father died when he was young. His father died just after the takeover by Dublin around 1940-42. He got pneumonia and died.
Yeah.
Because I remember Eamon saying that he remembered his father's funeral. The Lord Mayor was there and all the aldermen were there and every dog and devil was there. And the following day his mother got the eviction notice and moved out because the next station officer went to it.
And has Shane passed on since?
Yeah. Shane did.
Well,
April
April.
Bishop.
he did not. I don't know if you're last never were.
Should yeah. Should we do it with the Pear Street?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
that's right.
Well, I'm just astounded, I believe, do I take this right, that one time there's recruited an AO man. I'm just astounded that there's an AO man in the Dublin BNP.
The present chief is Tipperary. We're very open, very broad church.
Yes, you are. Yeah, further, more shock. Shock and awe. I just like to very much thank Laz. It was a wonderful lecture, and Laz, of course, I was here on that occasion for the launch of this magnificent book, Dublin Fire Brigade and the Irish Revolution, by Laz here, and I have an autographed copy by the author himself, so that will be very valuable in years to come, Laz, I think. Please God. Okay, but that's available in all good bookshops and available in the county library also. So thanks very much, lads. I'd just like to say, switch back on your mobile phones. Remember, we have a donation box at the back of the hall. And most importantly, our next lecture is a very prestigious night here. It's on Tuesday the 9th of December 2014. It's the Leo Swan Memorial Lecture. And the lecture on this particular night will be given by Gary Brannigan, and it's the Holy Wells of Dublin. So be there or be square, or be in the square, or something like that, okay? Thanks very much, folks.